We're gonna kind of change it up a little bit. We have final action on HB 2152 listed last. We're actually gonna do that first this morning. That way, anybody that's here for just that can go about their day. So with that, I will turn it over to David for just a quick review on HB 2152.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, committee. House Bill 2152 would make several adjustments relating to deposit investment of public monies in financial institutions. It would authorize financial institutions, these are banks, savings and loan associations, and savings banks, to secure governmental deposits above the amount insured or guaranteed by the FDIC by utilizing the public monies pooled method of securities. Prohibit investment advisors that execute bids for the investment of public monies from managing monies directly from such bid. Allows municipal bond proceeds and governmental unit deposits to be invested at a rate agreed upon by the governmental unit and financial institution. Establishes certain public money investment rates, and then requires certification from a governmental unit that deposits in the municipal investment pool first offered to a financial institution, and allows financial institutions to file complaints upon the failure to comply with such certification.
Thank you, David. Committee, do we have any questions for David? Seeing none, I will now bring up HB 2152. Committee, are there any amendments? I do have one amendment, committee. We can get that sent to you. It's going to be the amendment I sent out, I believe Friday afternoon. And we will turn it over to David for a quick overview of what that amendment does.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just kind of sent that out to Rich now, so just a minute to get that distributed. But it is also, I think, the amendment that should be in the S drive that was distributed out this weekend. I'd also have some physical copies if people need them. But,
does anybody want a physical copy? Representative McDonald, Representative Steens, and Coach looks like they would like physical copies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just kind of bear with me a little bit. There's quite a bit going on in this amendment. There's been a lot of discussion, as we heard, during the hearing, and some compromises. You go to page 2 of the amendment. This were now, it was an alternative. Banks could use the public monies pool method. This now requires it to be a shall, so they would be required to secure the deposit of public monies in excess of that FDIC amount by the public monies pooled method. And then the administrator shall not accept any public deposits from a governmental unit while administering the public monies pooled method pursuant to, and it should actually probably read this section since we're still in section 1. That was just a typo. The administrator shall submit a formal conflict of interest document in the manner prescribed by the treasurer. Then expenses of the administrator would be paid by the Office of State Treasurer and not be paid by the financial institutions utilizing the method. This also then strikes what was in subsection D, then inserts, if you go to attachment 1, which is towards the back of the balloon, this is new, it would be a new subsection D, E, F, G, H, so this would be attachment 1, new section 1. So the administrator will be tasked with assessing and managing the sufficiency of the public monies pooled method, including but not limited to compliance by a bank, savings loan association, or savings bank at the aggregate market value of the pool of securities in such bank, savings loan association, or savings bank is an amount not less than 102% of those public monies insured or guaranteed by the FDIC. And then to fulfill the duties of sections 1 through 3, the treasurer is provided a rules and regulations authority to administer and implement the provisions of those sections, including but not limited to rules and regulations to assess and manage the sufficiency of the public monies pooled method. And then subsection E, the financial institutions in which the public monies are deposited may at any time substitute, exchange, or release securities deposited if Such substitution, exchange, or release does not reduce the aggregate amount of those pools of securities below that 102% amount. And then the bank is required to notify the administrator if additional collateral is required to be pledged due to an increase in deposits placed by governmental units. And then also notify the administrator if that financial institution desires to release collateral due to a reduction in governmental unit deposits. The subsection F would be financial institution that satisfies the requirements to secure deposit of public monies or public funds in excess of the amount insured by the FDIC shall, on or before the 10th day of each month, render to the administrator a statement showing as of the last business day of the previous month the amount of public monies deposited in such financial institution that are not insured or guaranteed by the FDIC by each governmental unit separately, and all the governmental units in the aggregate, the aggregate market value of the pool of securities, and the name, phone number, and email address of a representative of each governmental unit represented in the pool. And subsection G, not later than 20 days after the deadline required in subsection F, the administrator would provide a report to the governmental unit reflecting the amount of public monies deposited in such financial institution by each governmental unit, and the aggregate market value of the pool of securities deposited as of the last business day of the previous month. And such report shall clearly notify the governmental unit if the value of the securities did not meet the statutory requirements. Subsection H on the back of this attachment 1 just says that if the administrator at any time determines that the value of the securities does not meet the statutory requirement, the administrator shall send notice to the financial institution up to 5 business days to give that financial institution 5 business days to adjust the securities to meet that statutory requirement. If the financial institution does not meet the requirement within that time frame, they may be subject to a fine or potential sanctions issued by the administrator pursuant to rules and regulations adopted by the treasurer. Then I would just become then that effective date. Again, this would become effective January 1, 2026. These sections 1 through 3 have a delayed effective date, and that remains. So into new section 2, kind of back in the bill text, we just replace treasurer with administrator throughout that section. And then also strike that on page 3, lines 14 and 15. So now it's just secured by a pool of securities pledged. No longer we strike that language involving deposited or its security interest has been granted. And in paragraph 2, line 31, there's a new sentence put in there that the administrator may liquidate securities pledged for immediate distribution if there's in the case of a default. And the treasurer is replaced by administrator throughout. And then we have language in line 42, this would be subsection B. Any liquidation occurring under the provisions of this section shall conform to the procedures that are established in section 2. Then going into page 4 of the bill, new section 3. The report that upon the request of the governmental units, the financial institution would have to provide that information on the amount of public monies deposited in such bank by the governmental unit making the request and the total amount of all of the governmental units that are secured by this pool of securities. And then such report would be made on or before a date that the governmental unit specifies. Then there's see the big balloon there, the big box, that'd be a whole new section 5. This would be if a financial institution has a good faith reason to believe that the governmental unit has not acted in compliance with statute, it may file a complaint with the state treasurer in writing in a form prescribed by the state treasurer. These complaints would be confidential, not subject to the Open Records Act, except as provided in this section. If the treasurer determines that the complaint does allege facts sufficient to constitute a violation of the statutes, the state treasurer will promptly investigate. And if after an investigation, the treasurer finds probable cause does not exist to believe the allegations, then the treasurer would dismiss the complaint. If they do find that there is probable cause to believe the allegations, that complaint would no longer be confidential, may be disclosed. And upon making of such finding, the treasurer would fix a time for a hearing on the matter, a public hearing, which should not be more than 3 days after such finding. In either event, the state treasurer shall notify the complainant and respondent of the determination of the treasurer. And then the treasurer shall also notify the attorney general and the pool money investment board of any apparent violation of law that is discovered during the course of the investigation. And then any governmental unit that knowingly violates these provisions upon a first violation would be required to complete a training program approved by the state treasurer. For any second or succeeding violation, the governmental unit shall be liable to the payment of a civil penalty not to exceed $500 for each violation. Those penalties would be paid into the Attorney General's Open Government Fund. Next amendment is just in page 7. There was subsection D in lines 5 through 13. This again, strike the may. This is now shall secure the deposits in these public monies pooled methods. What was section 6 of the bill, KSA 10-131, is being removed from the bill, so there'll be no changes to existing law. This was the part that dealt with the municipal bond proceeds. That statute's being removed from 2152, so there'd be no change. Then on page 12, lines, what would be the new subsection F there, lines 27 through 36. This again, the may changes to shall, secured by the public monies pool method. And then there's a new subsection G inserted that in selecting depository institution pursuant to subsection B2, the investing government unit shall allow an eligible finance institution the 2 business days to respond to the bid. I think that was brought up as part of the hearing, that they have that 2, and it is business days specified there. Section 8. What was section 8 now, KSA 12-1675A is being removed from the bill, so there would no longer be a change there. That was the statute that was going to change that investment rate to set that as the pool money investment board rate for the MIP, the Municipal Investment Pool Fund. That's all being removed now, so there'll be no change to that investment rate definition. Let's see, then page 14, line 32, the striking at the very end of that line, in the preceding calendar year, no longer need to be part of that listing for which the governmental unit requested bids. And then what was going to be a new subsection H is being stricken. That was the original complaint language in 2152, and that has now been superseded by the new section 5 language that we went over earlier. This would then also add in KSA 12-1677B. That's the final 2 pages of the attachment of the balloon at the very end here. This would reflect is the kind of the new language there in what would start kind of in lines 22 through 28, and kind of the underlined blue language. The certification from the investment staff that the procedures have been followed, and provide a listing of the banks, savings loan associations, or savings banks for which the city, county, or school district requested bids in the preceding year. Now, the new language would be also require an annual portfolio holdings report and form prescribed by the Pooled Money Investment Board, and any fee or cost to the city, county, or school district in paying for investment advisor services. The Pool Money Investment Board shall report annually to the legislature a list of cities, counties, and school districts who have been approved under this section, including documents provided in subsection C. So then kind of going back into the bill language. I think that is it. Then we're just conforming the title and repealer to reflect that we're removing 10-131 and 12-1675A, and then inserting 12-1677B to the title and repealer. I believe that's it, Mr. Chairman, so I can take any questions.
Thank you for that, David. Would you call this a technical amendment, or? Committee, any questions for David? Representative Rivas.
Yeah, I'm just curious if, I'm not going to read all the banking regulations and statutes, so I'm just going to ask is, there's a number of timelines in here as far as so many dates to notice, so many dates of to report things and assorted things. Does that match up to what typically goes through most of the other statutes regarding the financial institutions?
We can ask somebody from the KBA to answer that question, perhaps.
Hi, Kelly Vanswell, Kansas Bankers Association. Thank you for the question. When we looked at other, you're talking about the deadlines for the collateral pool
A lot of
sections.
deadlines and dates and yeah.
Yeah, so specifically on the collateral pool deadlines, we looked at other states who have a similar pool already in place and matched a lot of their deadlines. And then, yes, we try to make it uniform or at least reasonable compared to our other statutes.
Thank you.
Any further questions for David? Coach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I knew we told the two sides to get together and work this out. It almost looks like a whole different bill. I mean,
We'll get to that.
okay.
David, did
that's
we
that's
decide if
coming.
we're gonna do a house substitute?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, house substitute. Okay, yeah. So it will be a house substitute for a house bill. So, Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if this is for David or who, but do we anticipate how much this will be used? Do we have a goal in mind for how many dollars or how many times this would be used?
KBA back up.
For the pool piece, it'll be mandatory now, so all banks will have to use the pool to secure their funds. But when you say how much money, are you meaning how much money we're hoping to bring back? So we're hoping, Alex might speak better to this part, but on the pool part, it's gonna require all of us to use that to secure our funds. But we're hoping between the pool and then a couple of the other changes, like the bank CD program, we could potentially bring up to $1 billion back into Kansas. But if you want more specifics, I can have Alex hop on there.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. One is the, making sure this is correct, unlike last week. There's two parts to this. One regarding the municipal investment pool. The municipal investment pool is the local government alternative investment option that is through the state. That has grown to over $1 billion. We hope with some of these changes that balance can actually be reduced, where some of those funds, because of some of the changes and some of the collateral and pledging, it makes it easier and attractive at the local side of things. So hopefully we can draw that down significantly. On the CD program in its entirety, I know there's a limit in statute, I believe, where it might be internal policy, but it's 15% of the total PMIB. When we talk about $1 billion, that's when we're talking about 10% of funds. Kansas is historically, 15 years ago, used to be about 10%. So if we kind of use that same metric, that 10%, and it's based on the fiscal note as well, that's roughly the $900 million that's in the fiscal note. So once again, as Kelly said, I mean, it's probably north of $1 billion, possibly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Nathan, I see you back there. If you have anything to add on this amendment, and from my understanding, with this amendment, you guys become proponents. Is that correct?
Good morning, everybody. That's correct. Just want to once again thank the Bankers Association, thank the Treasurer's Office, and been a pleasure to work with them, and happy that we could come to compromise. So thank you.
Thank you for all your guys' help too and coming to the table on this committee. Do we have any further questions about the amendment, Representative Shipp?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it'd be helpful for me, certainly, because I have to write the bill brief, but the committee members as a whole, can somebody from the bankers or the cities kind of walk through kind of the process of when there are these idle funds and how this pool process would work?
So Representative Shu, we can do that too. I do have my bill brief already written if you just want to piggyback off that. But yeah, if the bankers, if anybody there just wants to explain maybe real quick how this process is going to work.
And Representative, you're talking about the pool part in particular? Okay. So the way it would work is the bank would take, so Bank of Kelly is working with 10 government units. So that means I have individual accounts for each of them. Right now, the way it works is I have to pledge my securities individually to each single one, requiring me to be really overpledged on all of those accounts. Right now, I can pool my securities over just my accounts. So I'm not mixing my collateral from my bank is not mixing with other bank collateral. I'm just pulling my collateral over my deposits to secure them one time. So I'm still probably going to be overpledged because you do want to have that cushion because the accounts fluctuate, but it will greatly decrease the amount I'm over pledged. And so now when I do that, I'll submit all that paperwork to the treasurer's office, and the treasurer or the administrator will double check. So we'll have a new third party that's making sure the funds are secured to the appropriate level. And then they will send paperwork back to us and back to the governmental units. Still at any time, the government unit and the bank can be in conversation about what's secured and how that's going. That won't change any of that. It's just going to add a third party to oversee that it is being collateralized to the statutory requirement. Does that make sense?
And then if I can, what is the benefit of having extra collateral on hand? Because you're going to be more efficient with the collateral and how you're pledging it. So what's the benefit to the banks of having that extra collateral?
Sure, that's a great question. So one benefit is this is just an easier and simpler process. It's a lot of paperwork when we're moving collateral and collateralizing these accounts. But the other key benefit is that collateral is then freed up for us to use in other ways in the bank. We can loan that money, use it on other accounts, and it just gives us more money to work with so we can do more economic development, more loans, all of that.
Committee, is there any questions for Kelly while we have her up here? Representative White.
I don't really know how to ask this, but can you maybe give us a history of municipal bonds? Can I still invest in muni bonds? It used to be the worst investment out there, but back to the 50s, it was a great investment. Is this the next step of taking the risk out of a personal investor?
So this bill will not touch any of that. The bond proceeds section was removed, so this won't do anything to bonds. And outside of that, I'm not an expert on the municipal bond procedure. I don't know if Nathan knows more than I do, but this shouldn't change anything on that. The bond proceeds section was taken out.
Still be a bad investment. Okay. Okay, thank you, and thank you, Alex, for that face. Thank you, Chairman.
All right, seeing no further questions, thank you, Kelly. And I need a second on my amendment. Representative Williams seconds it. Committee, is there any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, I will close on my amendment. All those in favor, aye. All opposed? Motion passes, and now HB 2152 becomes House substitute for HB 2152. I'll do it in the motion. Okay. So committee, is there any further discussion on this legislation? I see none. I will make the motion that we pass out House substitute for HB 2152 favorably. I have a second from Vice Chair Steens. Committee, any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor, aye. All opposed? Motion passes. I do want to take this moment again to thank everybody for getting in the room and really working this out. I think this is a great piece of legislation, and if we can even bring a fraction of $1 billion back and invest it in our local banks and our local communities, I think that's going to be great for our state. So thank you to both sides for coming to the table, working this out, and really helping us pass some great legislation. And thank you to the committee for your work on this as well. We will now open up a informational hearing on HB 2089. Committee, the reason this is informational only is because the deadline has passed. This bill was not blessed, so it is in essence dead for the session. But we're still going to run this informational hearing as a regular bill hearing. So we'll have proponents and opponents and time to ask questions and everything. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason for a quick overview on 2089.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2089 would enact the Consumer Inflation Reduction and Tax Fairness Act, which exempts portions of a credit card transaction constituting a tax or gratuity from assessment of the fee charged by the card issuer. I'll keep it pretty high level. There would be 5 new sections. They're the named act that I just mentioned. Section 2 has the definitions, so you might need to refer to a couple of those at some point. Section 3 is sort of the main policy section. That's the one that exempts the portion of a credit card transaction that would be a tax or gratuity from assessment of any fee charged by the card issuer. There are a couple ways that can happen, and I'm not an expert on any of this by any means. So there's one where the merchant transmits the tax or gratuity amount data as part of the authorization or settlement process, and that avoids having the fee charged on the tax or gratuity amount. Alternatively, the merchant can submit their tax documentation not later than 180 days after the date of the payment transaction, and within 30 days after that, the issuer credits the merchant the amount of the fees that were charged on the tax or gratuity. So there's kind of a two-part way that merchants can handle not paying the fee on those taxes or gratuities. Section 4 makes it unlawful for issuers, card networks, et cetera, to sort of find another way to make the charge that's prohibited by Section 3, just to put it as simply as I can. If you violate that, you could be subject to a civil penalty, and you could also have to pay, investigation charges and face injunctive relief, et cetera. So the final section, Section 5, just is severability. So that's kind of our standard clause. So if any provision is invalid or unconstitutional, it could be, the rest of it could be implemented to the extent that it could, and it would take effect on July 1st if adopted. I know it's very high level. Happy to answer any questions if you need me to.
Thank you for that, Jason. One quick question. Do we have anything currently in statute that bans or disallows a business from charging the employee or taking the credit card processing fee for tips out of the employee tip pool? Is there anything in law that prohibits that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. And since you gave me the heads up that you were going to ask about that was in the news a couple of years ago, I did find some news coverage about that being done by a few businesses. So to my knowledge, there is nothing that prohibits that practice.
Committee, any further questions? Thank you so much, Jason. All righty, up first, we'll call up Doug Cantor, the National Association of Convenience Stores. He's via WebEx. Doug, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person and have to testify remotely, but it helps to understand what's going on with these credit card fees when you consider this bill. The way credit card fees are charged is an ongoing problem for merchants around the country because two big entities, Visa and MasterCard, dictate what fees the banks will charge Main Street businesses and dictate down to very minute terms exactly how they will do it. And by controlling the system this way, there's no price competition. And therefore, the fees just get higher and higher. They've been up more than 60% just since 2020. The fees on Visa and MasterCard credit cards have nearly quadrupled since 2010. Now, the bill before you won't solve all of those problems. There's actually a bill in Washington that Kansas Senator Roger Marshall has that would try to dig into those bigger problems. But this bill would help with one of the most egregious and unfair areas of this system, which is where on price-fixed fees, centrally set by Visa and MasterCard, the credit card industry takes money from merchants that they don't even get to keep themselves, and that is tax money and tip money. And so they have to go into their own pockets to make up for the taxes or tips. To understand how unfair this is, just imagine for a moment that Kansas Department of Revenue employees were charged a special fee by the credit card industry for collecting money on behalf of the state of Kansas. Nobody would think that's fair. They certainly wouldn't think that's fair. And merchants are disadvantaged the same way. They're doing a service to the state for collecting these taxes. For our industry, not just in Kansas, but the Kansas businesses, when you count federal and state taxes, collect $2 billion of taxes. That is a lot of service for the state of Kansas and for the federal government. Yet overall, Kansas businesses are charged more than $100 million a year just in fees on sales tax in Kansas. They've got to make up that money, and it's not fair. Now, you'll hear some objections to this from the credit card industry today. They will say they can't do it, but they can. The information on taxes and tips is already in the transaction. In fact, Visa has a service to sell back sales tax information to merchants. And they tell merchants, oh, you don't need any new hardware to do this. It's very easy to do. The only difference is when it's a revenue raiser for Visa, they love it and it's easy. When it helps the merchant financially, Visa hates it and says it's impossible. Except when the senior advisor to the chairman and CEO of Visa testified before a Georgia study commission on this exact issue, he was asked point blank, well, could you do this? And he admitted that they could. He said they just didn't see the value in making the change. Well, of course they don't see the value. The value is in fairness here to the Main Street businesses that collect taxes on behalf of the state. In Illinois, where this law has already passed, processors like Cost Advisor have already come out and said, yeah, we'll be ready by the July deadline when this bill goes into effect. No problem. Now, you'll also hear that there's litigation in Illinois, and there is. But we should be clear about what that litigation says and what it does not say. The Illinois litigation is allowing this law to go forward and go into effect. It is pausing it for national banks and out-of-state banks while the litigation goes on so they can have a full trial and see what all the arguments are. But with respect to Visa and MasterCard, they said, yep, there's no preemption, there's no legal problem, this can go ahead. And as I said, what's interesting here is Visa and MasterCard set all the terms of these transactions. They make geographic differences today. They have thousands of pages of rules governing all of this, and they set the bank's prices. All the banks agree to charge the same thing that Visa and MasterCard tell them and carry out transactions exactly as Visa and MasterCard tell them. Now here in this one instance, Visa and MasterCard are trying to hide behind the banks and say, oh, no, we can't possibly do this. But they can. They've admitted that they can. And that law in Illinois will go forward. And it ought to be passed in more states, frankly, because that is the only fair way to go. Look, this current system not only is unfair to merchants, but consumers end up paying all of these fees. They just don't see it. It's hidden in the cost of goods. Merchant profit margins are tiny, among the smallest of any industry, because there's so much competition. They compete on price. The credit card industry should, but given that they don't, we've got to do something here to deal with this unfairness where merchants are made to make up this shortfall in tax revenue or make up this shortfall in tips to deal with the card fees that have already come out. So it's important to recognize the main difference here is who gets the money, not that it's impossible. In fact, the credit card industry, we should understand, takes money from merchants when there's fraud most of the time. More often than the bank pays for it, they make the merchant pay for it, according to the Federal Reserve, by 14-point spread. Merchants pay for more of that fraud, and that happens on a back-end process where the money gets taken away later, exactly as this bill would have as one of the options just described, where this can either happen at the time of the transaction or through a back-end reimbursement. There's already billions of dollars in back-end reimbursement. It only goes to the banking industry right now. The difference in this bill is not whether it's possible, not whether it's complicated, not whether it's hard. It's just that the credit card and banking industry don't want money to go back to the merchant. That is the only difference, and the only thing that makes this more complicated is that merchants, for once, would get a little bit of fairness in this system. Thank you for giving me a few minutes to speak to you about this, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Doug. We're going to hold off questions until we get through all the proponents, if that works for you, sir.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Up next, we have Brian Pulsler, Executive Director for Fuel True Independent Energy and Convenience. Paul, welcome to Wait, I'm sorry, Brian, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee members, for hearing my testimony this morning. I am Brian Postler. I'm the Executive Director for Fuel True Independent Energy and Convenience. We are the nonprofit statewide trade association that represents all the independent fuel distributors and also serve as the voice of convenience stores and all the fuel retailers across Kansas. So House Bill 2089 is a small attempt to address this much larger problem that Doug was just talking about. And I'm here to tell you that our members here in Kansas do request some relief. So what's really going on? Retailers are required by the state, compelled by you all, to collect sales tax revenue on all of our transactions. And every time a transaction is made with a card, we not only pay the swipe fee on the transaction itself, but we also have to pay the swipe fee on the tax that you all force us to collect. Right? And in fact, the money comes out, we don't even, like if it's a $100 transaction, we get $97 roughly deposited in our account. And then we have to turn around and pay the state the tax on the full $100, right? Because the credit card companies get their cut first before the merchant gets anything. Credit and debit card swipe fees have soared more than 50% since the pandemic. They reached a record $172 billion in 2023, and they're going to be higher this year. For many of my merchants, this is the highest operating cost of any other than the labor, right? The number one expense that retailers have to pay are these profits to the largest credit card companies in the country. And so we have the situation where these incredibly large credit card issuing companies that dictate all the terms to the community banks, we have no issue with the local banks. It's with these national firms that are out of Delaware that are dictating the terms of how this all works. They're getting record profits, and Kansas consumers feel they can't even afford a dozen eggs. And so remember, years ago, when we thought about the way that banks worked and the way that credit cards worked, you think about, oh, well, the bulk of the money is in the interest, right? The average interest rate for a credit card in this country is over 21% today, right? So every Kansan, on average, owes $6,818 as of Q4 2024. That's what they owe on credit cards on average, every consumer in Kansas. And so at 21% annual interest rate on average, that means they're paying about $1,464 interest. So credit cards are an incredibly profitable business for those that extend those lines of credit without any interchange fees at all. So all we're asking is that we have a little bit of fairness on the sales tax portion of the transaction. So not paying interchange fees on the sales taxes would do nothing to materially affect the bottom line of Visa and MasterCard and some of these large banks. JP Morgan last year had over $54 billion of net profit after all their expenses. The average net profit margin for Visa was 51% in 2021 and up every year. 2024, their net profit margin was 54.95%. For convenience stores, the average net profit margin is not 55%, it's about 5%. Right? And it varies a little bit. Some of them are making 8 or 9%. Some of them are making 2 or 3% as their net profit margin for my members. But that means for those on the low end, Visa and MasterCard and the banks are making more profit out of that location than the owner who actually owns and operates that business, takes all the risk, does all the work in that business. They get less total profit than the big banks get. And that's just not fair. It didn't used to be that way, and it shouldn't be. And so don't let them tell you this is too difficult to implement. All the technology is there. The interchange systems are great. And honestly, the big multinational banks could choose to hold all the local community banks in Kansas completely harmless on this bill. They could keep them all whole and give them the same cut that they currently get, the same profit they currently get, just by changing those terms a little bit. And all that would mean was that the big national banks in Delaware would have to go back to last year's, at the time, record profit margins instead of this year's new record profit margins, right? So there's plenty of money there to accomplish this without hurting any bank in Kansas. They just have to have the will to do it. And so I'm just asking for this fairness. because we will pass on those savings. The last thing I'll share with you is that we are the only industry in this state foolish enough to put our prices in 3-foot-high numbers right at the curb, right? And we know that some of you will drive an extra 5 miles to save 2 cents on a gallon of gas. And so we have to be incredibly price sensitive and price competitive. And so if we have the opportunity to pass some of these savings on to our consumers, we will do it. And we will give inflation a bit of a break, give consumers a bit of a break, and we will help solve this unfairness problem that we have. So I will take the questions at the appropriate time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Brian. All righty, last proponent we have today is Dan Murray, Kansas State Director for the National Federation of Independent Business. Dan, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dan Murray. I'm the Kansas State Director for NFIB. We're the voice of small business representing about 4,000 members across the state, many of whom are retailers. I can tell you that I can't really do a better job than the two gentlemen that preceded me, but I wanted to put a local flair on it in terms of the representation of small businesses in Kansas. Small business retailers, restaurateurs operate on notoriously thin margins, particularly relative to their large competitors. We're now competing with Amazon online in terms of retail competition. We believe this is a matter of fairness. And Brian really pointed out articulately very well. And so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too much more. But what I would say is we do serve as a tax collector for the state of Kansas. In fact, there's a bill, and there has been for probably the entire time that I've been working as a state director, that would at least give vendors compensation for collecting and remitting to the state sales taxes. It's never happened because of some fiscal note concerns. Many of our surrounding states receive this compensation, but that's another story. That being said, on top of it, we're being asked to pay fees on sales taxes collected by the credit cards. And so we think it's a matter of fairness, and I just will end it with that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that, Dan. Committee will now open up to questions on the proponents. I'll start firing away. Whoever wants to answer this, and Dan, you kind of touched on it there with that legislation. It seems to me there's two different discussions here. The tip discussion is one discussion. Money, I believe it was Doug that said money that they don't keep, although tips are used to offset payroll of waitresses. So that's one discussion. But the other discussion, it doesn't sound like the beef should really be with the credit card companies on the remittance of taxes. It sounds like the beef you guys should have is with us in the state of Kansas. So I guess if we could go into that a little bit, why should it be the credit card companies that have to make this up? It sounds like you guys should be mad at us for us forcing you to collect these taxes without giving you any type of relief.
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. I guess I probably confused the issues a little bit by bringing that issue up. And so I may have made a strategic mistake in terms of communicating to the committee about what the concern is. The issue at hand today is the fee on taxes that are collected, the interchange fees collected by the credit card companies, as we know. And so I want to stick to that. But certainly if we have a conversation about vendor compensation on retailers collecting sales tax and remitted to the state, that's a separate conversation. I think it's separate and apart and distinct from this discussion.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, maybe I asked my question a little wrong and confusingly. You guys are asking for this legislation to basically force the credit card companies to perform a service almost free of charge on just the sales tax side. Is that kind of what you guys are focusing on here? I mean, is that basically the ask? You're asking to be exempt from the credit card companies for the collection of the sales tax, the swipe fees on the sales tax?
Mr. Tanner, I think.
Yeah, if I could, Mr. Chairman, what I would say is the credit card industry gets a fee on the entire amount of the transaction, including sales tax, including tips. That's how it happens today. They get the highest fees in the industrialized world on these transactions. If they didn't get the fee on the sales tax or tip portion of the transaction, they would still get the highest fees in the industrialized world. Their fees are more than 7 times higher than the rate merchants pay in Europe, more than 4 times higher than what they pay in Australia. We are way out of whack with respect to how high these fees are. So no, they will get the richest fees on earth, even if this bill passes. Won't be doing anything for free with profit margins, as Mr. Posler pointed out, of well over 50%, and understand where that ranks. This industry, the banking industry, has the highest profit margins of any industry in the United States, higher than oil, higher than tobacco, higher than pharmaceuticals, higher than investment banks. And part of it is because of what's going on here. So no, they will get huge fees. They're not doing any service for free. They will still get fees in the hypothetical $100 transaction on whatever it is, about $97 of it, and they will still be huge compared to what anyone else does. That's why, as I noted, more needs to be done here to make this system fair. This is just a very small corner of it we're talking about today.
If I could follow up with that, and thank you for that answer, Doug. But what I'm saying though is they will still do the processing of the $97. But what you guys are asking us today is this little side fee for the sales tax and the tips, not to basically you're asking them to process that charge free of charge.
Well,
That's where I'm getting at the free portion of it. You're wanting them to initiate that mechanism free of charge. They'll still do the base, the whatever the food cost, whatever the service cost was, but that side piece you're asking them to do it for free. When it appears to me, you guys should be mad at the state of Kansas for not giving you guys any relief, any sort of tax credit on those fees from the state of Kansas for collecting, remitting those sales tax to us as a state.
I appreciate it. And what I would say is it's all one transaction, right? So there's not any part of it from our perspective that's happening free. They're still getting huge fees. It's just a matter of how you calculate the cost. The vendor comp, if I will, what that is actually in many states just reimbursing the company for the merchant for their internal costs, staff time, accounting time. It's those types of things. That doesn't compare to the fees they pay, like I said, over $100 million in Kansas through the swipe fees on the sales tax amount. So it really is a separate thing, and certainly a legitimate and separate discussion. But the amount of these fees is a much more significant and different thing, because the merchant actually has to take out of their own pocket funds to make up the deficit to the state in terms of the tax amounts.
Ryan, did you want to add anything, sir?
Yeah, just one other note related to that, to what Doug shared, is that the main problem and distinction, I think, for your question, Mr. Chairman, is that the swipe fees are completely divorced from the reality of the cost to offer the interchange network, right? So there is some cost to be borne by the companies by processing the transaction. And like my members' fees will often be structured in a way like this particular fee is 2.8% of the transaction plus a nickel, right? And they do the plus a nickel because there is some cost of actually transmitting and doing the work to offer the network. But as inflation happens and things get more and more expensive, the profit margin on those fees continues to go up. Plus, they keep jacking up the rates, additional amounts. It did it again in 2022, billions of dollars of additional fees. And we're just held hostage because we can't not take Visa and MasterCard and have any customers come in our store. We have to offer it. And so there's no upper bound on what those swipe fees can be for the big banks, but it's completely divorced from the reality of what it costs to process. So because we're not touching the entire rest of the transaction, we're only dealing with the sales tax, there'll be plenty of money to be had to compensate them for the actual running of the network.
Committee, any further questions? Vice Chair Steens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have been at some retail stores now where they actually have charged me the fee. And so I'm assuming that that's okay as long as the consumer knows about it. I'm sure there's some small businesses, as you mentioned, that can't afford that. And I'm also, is it not just Visa and MasterCard? Are we talking American Express, Discover, where all these other cards may be taken? So that's a question I have, because obviously we're probably paying more in prices as consumers, but we're also being charged some of these fees as well.
And Vice
Maybe you
Chair
can-
Steen's on the passing of the credit card charges off to you. You can blame Ranking Member Shu. I believe he voted for that last year. Does anybody want to answer Vice Chair Steen's question?
I'd be happy to add a couple words. We have seen that become more common recently. Most merchants don't like to do that because their customers get upset with them, but they have reached a point of desperation, as we pointed out, with the fees up 60% in the last few years, and it being the second highest cost. A lot of small businesses in particular have said, we don't know what to do anymore. We've got to pass it on. So that is certainly a sign of how difficult it has become for all of these merchants, and the fact that these problems are spilling over in a way that's disrupting the normal relationship between businesses and their customers.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian, a quick question for you, please. You mentioned that it didn't used to be like this. What was it like before?
So the transaction fees were always applied and always part of the network. But what's happened is that as inflation has occurred over time, the rates that are charged for those cards have become more divorced from the reality of what it costs to provide the network, right? And they'll tell you all about all the security elements, all the things they have to do, and it is expensive to provide the network. So I'm not saying there's not costs there, but just as $50 doesn't buy anymore what it bought in 1952, right? What happens is every time inflation occurs, it just pads the margin of the big credit card banks, which is why they are, their net profit margin just keeps going up and up and up every year.
So that's an opinion you have then? Yeah, that's an opinion that you have that they're getting more percentage profit on that then. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's all for the.
Representative Bohai. Sorry.
Chair, I was going to add one thing to Representative King's question. The other thing that's exacerbating the problem is more and more people are using credit cards and debit cards and not cash. So a lot of the sales that would have occurred in years past would have been cash payments instead of debit and credit cards. So that's added to the problem.
Representative Bohai.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. So I am definitely understanding why some gas stations say you get a cash discount, because that just makes a lot of sense, right? And I also understand, because I've helped find some credit card processing for some different organizations I used to work for, that each credit card has a different processing fee. So you can't even have in your budget a set amount, right? You almost have to over budget what the processing fees are going to be, is how I understand it. So depending on if you have the rewards card from American Express or the Chase Sapphire card, or if you have a cash rewards card, each of those credit cards, and the consumers don't typically know this, have a different fee associated with using them. So I guess, now I will just say this, using the word fair just raises my hackles. Fair should not come into the equation. Let's have something else. Let's find a different word. I do think we need to have more open and transparency with what's going on and how these fees are collected and what happens there. But the word fair just makes me like, that's their business model, right? And so I do think that there is an issue here, and I do think that there is a problem here. My question is, what are the rate increases, and can we see what the rates were back in 2015, 2019, 2020? Can we get a copy of that at some point in time when we have to work this bill, so we can have an idea of what's actually been happening and how we can possibly go forward?
Yeah, if the proponents want to get that to Rich and we can email it out. And a point of clarification, this bill is dead for the year. We're past deadline, so we won't be working the bill this year. But yeah, if the proponents want to get any information to Rich, and he can get that out to the committee, absolutely. Any further questions for the proponents, Coach?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just asking. I've had some constituents ask about the same problem. why can't this go to the tax committee that's still taking bills? Because I think this is very important. So just a thought.
I don't get to pick and choose where people introduce the bills. They brought it to this committee, that's where it was introduced, so, and it's too late to move it to the tax committee now because after the deadline, you can't just move bills, non-exempt bills into exempt committees and it magically makes them exempt, so that would be why. But, it's a discussion worth having, that's why we agreed to hold this informational hearing today. Committee, any further questions? Representative Neely.
I'm just being ornery. It's more of a statement, but wouldn't it solve the whole problem if they charged the individual for having a credit card and not charge fees to use it? The person that's using it should be the one paying the fees, not the merchants that's taking it. It seems like to me, but granted, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people would not take too kindly to that enormous fee that they would probably have at the beginning for having that. But it seems to me like it should actually go to the individual and not the merchant for using the card.
Yeah, and if you remember, Representative Neely, last year when we passed the UCCC updates, that was included in there to give businesses the option of passing those credit card fees on to the customer if they so choose. But
And if I may, Mr. Chair, I think both of you made excellent points that point to one of the other real problems here is just the opacity for consumers and for merchants. As the representative indicated, my merchant has no idea what they're going to have to pay at the month end on their credit card fees, because they don't know if you're coming in with, you know, a platinum that has this rate or a sapphire that has that rate. And so we take the swipe. It's not at all clear to us what we've just agreed to pay to Visa or MasterCard. And it's not till the end of the month that we get a statement that say, well, this is what you owed this month because of the cards that happen to be used. And so similarly, the consumers have no idea that if they use a debit card, they are paying a lot less in interchange fees than if they use a credit card, right? They may not, you know, many consumers would not know what a huge difference there are between those two. But if we could just educate everyone to use the debit cards, then the swipe fees would go down and those prices would be reflected and it would be better for everybody in terms of the consumers. And so, you know, this doesn't get anywhere near close to that, but it's that lack of everyone understanding what those fees really are that makes it really challenging.
last question, Representative Steens, and then we're going to move on to the opponents.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So back to your point about the credit versus the debit card, if you put it in as credit, is it the same charge? Or if you put it in as debit, because you know a lot of people don't like to enter their 4-digit PIN, so they'll put it in as credit. I know I do that a lot. Is there a difference in that transaction fee?
Absolutely. So the debit cards, and this is because Congress had the will to regulate and force some competition on the interchange fees on debit cards. That's the national bill we're trying to work on for credit cards, is to just say, because if you look at the back of a debit card, often you'll see multiple networks and their little images. And just the fact that there's competitors means the merchant gets to decide, I'm going to use the Cirrus network, or I'm going to use the Star network. And just having that little bit of competition brings down the fees. We don't get that opportunity with credit cards, right? And so if it gets run as a credit card, then it's whatever Visa and MasterCard dictate to the banks, and that's what we all have to pay. And so it's many times more significant a fee on the credit card than it is on the debit card, just because there's a little bit of competition on the interchange side for debit cards.
Yeah, and I would note, if I could, I think that the point about the consumer fees is an excellent one. And I would just note that the banks do charge consumers very significant fees, $6 billion a year in annual fees and a number of late fees and other fees like that. The difference here and why this system is so problematic is that each bank makes those decisions with respect to their own customers, and customers can move and get a different credit card. Here, Visa and MasterCard set the prices to the merchants centrally, and all the banks follow it. Literally no other industry in the United States is able to operate this way on a centrally fixed price that all the competitors follow. And so that's where this disjunction between what consumers pay and should pay and what merchants pay is so egregious. you know, as well as the fact that, you know, once you look at the merchant adding it on or things like that, then consumers don't actually know where it's coming from and blame the merchant for it and that sort of thing.
All right, thank you for that, Doug. And we will go ahead and close the opponent side. Thank you to, or I'm sorry, the proponent side. Thank you to all three proponents. We do have a written proponent as well from Scott Schneider with the National or Kansas Restaurant Association. So, Scott, thank you for getting that in. We will now turn it to the opponents. Up first, we're going to call Alex Orrell with the Kansas Bankers Association. Alex, welcome to the committee again.
Thank you, and I'm so happy to talk about something else besides public funds. I've been talking about that nonstop. So no, Mr. Chairman, appreciate the opportunity to be here in opposition to HB 2089. There is a gentleman that is on WebEx that is a dedicated expert on this subject too. So some of my comments I'm going to leave to him. I'm not going to respond to some of the comments that were made in the last 30 minutes. A little frustrating. I think attacking on the industry and attacking fees. There's a cost of doing business, and I'll get into some of that here in a second. But HB 2089, there's a mirrored proposal already in Illinois that they did pass that is being currently litigated in federal court. I've been around this building now for 14 years, and one big argument in this building is why would the state of Kansas ever decide to move forward with a piece of legislation that would make the state liable? That if this bill were put into effect, it would expose Kansas to legal liability and financial risk with, I'm going to argue, no clear benefit to the state or its citizens. And when they're talking about the Illinois bill going into effect and being in effect, you know, one thing that is also failed to be mentioned here is, yes, out-of-state chartered banks are not exempt to it or not subject to it. National banks are not subject to it, but the state chartered ones are. And in Kansas is a strong community bank state, as you've heard me state many, many times. So yes, it is in effect for the state charters. What this bill would actually do to our Kansas community banks would put us on a very unlevel playing field now, where those things would be subject to only the state chartered banks. When you hear the proponents talk about going after the big national banks, this bill would do nothing to that effect because of the legal case already being playing out in Illinois. You talk about fees, and I want to maybe dive into this one a little deeper, but I want to say when they're talking about fees, they're talking about the gross fees that they are paying for interchange. They're not talking about the interchange fee itself. Interchange fee has actually remained pretty flat, and I know a proponent has a chart on that in his slides, but the fee itself has been relatively flat. So has the gross fees gone up? Absolutely. There's significant more transactions being done on the digital marketplace. So to argue and just say fees have continued to go up, I think they fail to mention about the significant gross receipts that they've also benefited from on this, from the digital marketplace. There is a lot of fraud going on, and these fees do help pay for combating the fraud and the safety and security of the financial rails we operate in. Talk about not being competitive. There is currently no barrier to entry for somebody to enter into, you know, to do what Visa, Amex, Discover, and all those kind of companies do. There's nothing stopping anybody. Is it expensive? Sure, it is. The payment rails that we operate in are very sophisticated and very secure. You don't want somebody coming in and not knowing what they're doing either and putting your transaction at risk and your financial information at risk. So once again, the interchange fees themselves have stayed stagnant. Also, one big piece of it too is interchange on taxes and tips is deductible on state and federal income taxes. So they mentioned these fees that they're paying for interchange, they're already deductible on state and local income taxes. So that's one big piece I'll mention there too. So I would caution this committee to move in this bill forward in the future and let the litigation play out for one. You know, it's already faltering in Illinois. It's been expanded multiple times, most recently a month ago now. And so we do have concerns that this, once again, would put the state in a very bad light from a legal and financial risk side of things. Having conversations about fraud, I appreciate our merchant partners. And this is a really tough one for us to get up and talk about in opposition because many of these people are our customers. And that's a tough one, but I do respect their opinion and respect what they do for Kansas. I know they employ a lot of people and do great things. And we'll always continue to work with them on these things, but on this piece of legislation, there's some serious concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair now.
Thank you, Alex, for that presentation. We'll wait committee until the end of our opponents. Next, we have Kel Beam from the Kansas Credit Union Association. Kel, welcome to committee.
Thank you. Good morning, committee. Thank you, Vice Chair Steens, Ranking Member Hsu, and the whole committee for the opportunity to appear on behalf of the Kansas Credit Union Association today as an opponent to House Bill 2089. The Kansas Credit Union Association represents 60 credit unions headquartered in Kansas and over 790,000 Kansans that are credit union members. As a reminder, credit unions are nonprofit, member-owned financial institutions focused on providing affordable financial services to our member communities. Unlike other financial institutions, all credit union profits are returned to our member owners. We are opposed to House Bill 2089 and believe it represents unnecessary government intervention that would be harmful not only to Kansas credit unions and banks, as Alex mentioned, but also to Kansas consumers. We believe there are several negative consequences that this legislation would have, including an increased vulnerability to fraud and cybersecurity threats, decreased credit availability for Kansas individuals and small businesses, and an increased legal liability, not only for financial institutions, but also for the state. Debit and credit card payments options benefit everyone involved, not only the customers, but the merchants as well. Merchants who choose to accept debit and credit card transactions realize the benefits of guaranteed and instant payments. They're no longer spending time chasing down bounced checks or dealing with the large costs associated with carrying cash. It also allows them to offer more payment options to consumers, including online payments. In exchange for these benefits, merchants pay a small fee, typically about 2% on credit card transactions. This fee is split between the merchant's financial institution, the customer's financial institution who issued the card, and the card network itself. The revenue generated from these fees is not pure profit. The fees go to fund the cost of operating the network, including things like network and fraud protection, credit card reward programs, and other operational expenses. Card networks and financial institutions are dealing with highly sensitive data. We're talking about people's personal financial information. And because of that, billions of dollars have been invested over the years to build out and secure the network's infrastructure and the data that flows back and forth on that network. Interchange revenue is an important part of financing these security improvements. When data theft or fraud does occur, financial institutions cover the cost of the fraudulent transaction and the costs associated with reissuing new cards. It's important to note that the loss of this interchange revenue would not eliminate the costs associated with running the network, which means the revenue would have to be made up from other sources and force changes to the way that our credit unions operate. As I mentioned earlier, all credit unions are nonprofits. Our profits are passed back to our member owners. So the loss of this interchange revenue could result in higher loan rates, lower rates paid on savings, and the loss of services offered to our members, including card rewards and free checking accounts. Lastly, I know you've heard from financial institutions, credit unions, and banks in the past about the large regulatory and compliance burden that we're facing and the negative impact that that has on not only on the financial institution, but on the communities we serve. And we believe House Bill 2089 would simply add to that already large compliance burden. As Alex has mentioned, Illinois passed legislation very similar last year, and that legislation is currently in litigation. We believe passing it here in Kansas while the litigation is still pending would simply expose the state to liability. With that, I'll close. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today, and I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Kel. Last up, we have Steve Rauschenberger on behalf of the Electronic Payments Coalition via WebEx. Steve, welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm a recovering Illinois state senator, so I'll try to be brief. I understand how hearings go. I've got a set of slides. I don't know if you guys can put those up for me. I would appreciate it if you can. If not, we'll move without them. A few elements about the electronic payment system that it's important.
Steve, it does not look like we have the slides.
Okay.
So,
well, we're going to go without them then.
all right, that works.
We'll make sure some of the information that the committee has asked for is available to them. They're included in the slides. But just from the beginning, the electronic payment system is a global payment system. It was built by the private sector. It's completely voluntary. It's open to all financial institutions, big and small. This is not just a system that benefits the Chase or the Wells Fargos of the world. The smallest credit union, it does exist. The smallest credit union or the smallest bank, community bank in Kansas can participate. It's a highly competitive marketplace internally. And when you think of all the fintech development.
Steve, we do have the slides up now.
Yep, I do see them, and I'll ask you to move them as I'm ready. More than 90% of adult Americans participate. There's 93% satisfaction among your voters and constituents with the system. It's virtually open to any merchant. It's got competitive negotiable contracts for processing. There's more than 10,000 banks worldwide that issue credit cards and debit cards in the system, including credit unions, small banks, financial institutions. There's 9 major networks, 30 major processors, and millions of cardholders. Now, the question of what interchange is, this slide will help maybe the committee a little bit, and we'll make sure you get copies of this. But essentially, when the transaction takes place, there's a contractually agreed to merchant discount. So the $100 transaction is run through the system. $98 of that or whatever is returned to the merchant's bank. Whatever the merchant discount is, 2%, 2.5, 2.25 is deducted and then paid out by the network. If you take a look, the largest single piece of that is the interchange fee. The interchange fee goes to the bank or credit union or financial institution that issued the card, that pays for that expensive chip card, that mails the monthly statements, that takes the credit risk on the purchase if it's a credit transaction. The next smallest piece is the acquirer fee. That goes to the bank the merchant has contracted with, or the processor the merchant has contracted with to be their processor. And the smallest piece goes to those two villains that merchants love to hate, MasterCard and Visa. That's the network fee. MasterCard and Visa do not get interchange fees. So, there seems to be some confusion. The interchange fee goes to the issuing bank, the people that take the credit risk. Next slide, please. Exempting sales tax from interchange is bad policy. Interchange is a fee for service model. The whole system is based on if you send $5,000 worth of transactions through the system, your percentage is based on the $5,000. That's the amount on a credit transaction that the bank or credit union extends in credit. That's what they deal with. That's their risks. Bifurcating that system or asking the system somehow to go in and separate elements of a transaction and treating them different calls the whole concept of a global payment system at risk. Who's going to inform and educate the Bank of Nova Scotia or the Bank of London or the Bank of Paris about the rules in Kansas and how somehow we've got to account for the tax, sales tax, and account for the tip amount, which is very difficult to verify. Next slide. It's often lost on people, this idea that Visa and MasterCard or American Express or Discover are painful for the retailers to take, but they get lots of benefits from them. There's merchant benefits from the credit cards, which is why merchants have moved towards them. Over 70% of merchants report that they're happy with the electronic payment system until you ask them about whether they like to pay their fees. I love the toll roads, except I don't like paying the tolls in Illinois. But there's benefits to these systems, and they're highly competitive. There's fintech being developed every day out in California to add competition to this system. I mean, you can just take a look and think of all the new fintech ways that your kids pay for transactions. Next slide. Yeah, this is the slide of interchange rates. The black line is the average interchange rate reported by third parties. The amount of interchange has been effectively flat for the last 9 years. Now, the fees, the percentage of sales that are being paid increases because there's a growth in the use of credit cards. But the interchange rate that people complain are doubling or growing by 60% or whatever, it's simply not true. We don't know what every merchant's merchant discount is because those are private contracts between the merchant and their processor. But effectively, the rates over the last 9 years have been flat. Next slide. Just to give you a quick idea of why this bill gains a lot of traction and who's excited about it. This, you can give this to your staff and have them work through it. But this is a breakdown of what we believe a $1 million Kansas small business would save if this bill were to pass and if this bill were not to be enjoined by the courts. About $78 a month for changing their software, likely their hardware, and having to deal with the other changes. Now, on the other hand, Home Depot might earn close to $85,000 a month. So you can kind of sort of wonder, or you can guess where some of the enthusiasm comes for asking the global payment system to subsidize the collection of sales tax. Next slide. The current system is pretty simple. You present the bill, the credit card goes through the authorization system, finalized, and it's over with. It settles daily. It's good for the customers. The customers know exactly what it does. Customers tend to tip more on the electronic payment system. There's much lower risk of theft. There's not cash problems. This is a system that works. Next slide. What restaurants want the government to intervene and simply lower an expense they don't like paying. There's lots of things that restaurants collect they don't get to keep. They really don't get to keep their rent. They collect it check by check and they pay their rent. They collect their check and they have to pay wages. They collect their check and they have to pay utility expenses. So to somehow argue that the small percentage they pay for electronic transactions is somehow entirely different than everything else is just simply not true. All businesses do business and hand over amounts they raise or amounts they earn to people they've contracted with. The merchants aren't required to take credit cards and debit cards. They take them because they're good for the business. They take them because they're good for their customer. They take them because it's effective for their business. Next slide. This idea has been pitched for more than 15 years. It's been, for me, since leaving the Illinois General Assembly, the Illinois Senate, almost a career. So I got to thank Doug Cantor and the National Retail Federation and others for keeping a kind of a lame bill alive. This has been introduced as standalone legislation over 60 times. Never has it passed the legislature after having full hearings. The only time it ever passed was in Illinois when it was passed in the last 48 hours of the legislative session. It was 6 pages and a 1,300-page budget implementation bill and never had a separate independent hearing. So to argue somehow that this works are intuitive to the fact that legislatures all over the country have studied this and looked at it and decided that there are other ways to help small businesses besides interdicting the global payment system. Next slide. Federal courts already limited the enforcement of this law, and we expect more rulings from the judge. Essentially, the judge has said that the proponents of the lawsuit are likely to prevail, and this Illinois bill is likely preempted under the federal banking statutes. She has yet to rule on federal credit unions. She's already ruled that out-of-state banks that are state chartered are if they're out of Illinois are exempt. So it looks like in the end that the Illinois bill could only apply to state chartered credit unions and state chartered banks in Illinois. And that's not getting at what retailers are asking for. It doesn't solve their problem. It really only costs a lot of people a lot of money to be in federal court for the next 2 years while they hammer this thing out. We think it's much better for states to wait and see how this works out before they jump into the pool and be involved in the next federal hearing. The Comptroller of the Currency, who normally doesn't weigh in on state legislation, reviewed the Illinois bill and filed a friend of the court brief in that case and called the Illinois bill ill-conceived, highly unusual, and largely unworkable. Said if the bill is allowed to remain in effect, it's likely that the fraud risk would increase significantly, consumer services would be constrained, and public trust would decline. Now, these are third parties. This is not Steve Rauschenberger saying it or the Electronic Payment Coalition. This is a federal judge and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency say that this bill doesn't work. Next slide. Exempting these things from the interchange would cause operational chaos. In order to go in and separate sales tax, you have to do it in a way that's auditable, because you have to assure international banks that the amount of sales tax that you're deducting from the transaction is correct and that it's verifiable. So you'd have to have a system that somehow decided what was taxable and what was non-taxable and retain that in some kind of database so that it could be audited. Now that's kind of sort of flies in the face of consumer privacy. Today, the global payment system only needs to know the amount and where you're transacting and how much and who the customer is. We don't need to know anything about what's in your shopping cart. But if you were to require that somehow sales tax be separated, you'd have to have a way to verify that for all of the 10,000 banks that participate in the system. Same thing goes for tips, which is even harder. Mathematically, you can kind of back into what the sales tax implications would be, but how would you assure that restaurants across Kansas were accurately and effectively reporting their tipped amount? I mean, these are just complications to a system for very, very small gain by the merchants, which likely wouldn't even prevail in court. Next slide. The current system right now, it's pretty simple, straightforward. The government gets their taxes, the retailer gets their money, the customer gets their product. In the new system, if this were to be proposed or were to be passed and allowed, probably we're looking at multiple transactions. Most people believe that if this bill were to survive court challenge, that what you'd do is you'd have to do one swipe of the card for the merchandise and a separate one for the sales tax amount, so they could be segregated and accounted for, and probably a third swipe for the tip amount. It's not clear to anybody because this is done nowhere else in the world. Nowhere in the world is the global payment system asked to look inside a shopping cart and separate elements to charge differential rates. Next slide. Submitting tax documentation within 180 days does nothing to make this policy feasible. In fact, it makes it kind of sort of worse if you think about it. These transactions are settled in minutes. By the end of day, that all the cash is already distributed. So you're saying that the Bank of Frankfurt has got to be prepared for a merchant in Kansas to take a tourist restaurant check and file for a 35-cent refund 180 days later. If you think about that, that doesn't make any sense at all. And clearly, the record keeping for paper would far exceed the benefits of anybody filing a claim up to 180 days later on paper for the system. And it's not even clear who they would file that with. Do they file that with the network, with the processor? Do they have to connect with the Bank of Frankfurt or the Bank of London or the Bank of, Florida? These things are not solutions to the problem. Next slide. Retailers conflating fixed costs with variable costs. When people talk about it being the third largest expense, according to the IRS, interchange fees represent less than 1% of restaurants' costs nationally. So I don't know how they get to that to be the third largest. If you take their entire merchant discount, it's probably 2.2 to 2.5% of their sales volume. So I don't know how any of them could be, have rent that was less than 2%. If they do, they've got a great lease. If they've got healthcare expenses that are less than 2%, they've got a great healthcare policy. There's just a lot of expenses. So when people talk about their third largest or their second largest expense, according to IRS data, that's pretty hard to believe. In most cases, the interchange and the merchant discount represent the 8th or 9th or 10th smallest expense reported to the IRS. Next slide. Well, we can kind of skip this one, but next slide. We don't need to move along here. So I just want to thank you. It's been great talking with you. I wish I could be there. I would maybe get an opportunity to come if you review this again. We're very proud of the payment system. We think it works well. It works for customers. If you've ever wondered why gas stations got out of the business of gas cards, why big, huge retailers like Walmart don't have their own merchant credit card, it's because this system costs less than operating their own system. This is a highly competitive system that serves customers and merchants well. We hope you'll stay out of it, and we can all watch and see what happens in the Illinois bill. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Steve. Appreciate you WebExing in here. Committee, we have time for just a couple of quick questions for the opponents. Are there any questions for the opponents? See, Representative Steens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You guys, I can't remember if the opponents mentioned this or the proponents, but maybe someone can answer the question. When there's fraud, did you say the merchant pays for that or the credit card company pays for that?
In the way it works in the system is if the retailer complies with the transaction rules and uses a chip reader, that the fraud is borne by the financial institution that issued the card. If at the merchant they permit somebody to swipe instead of dipping, if they don't follow the transaction rules, or what happens most often, if the customer disavows the transaction. I ordered a soap dish and it was broken. I'm not paying for it. That's charged back to the merchant. So there's a difference between fraud charges and merchant chargebacks. Sometimes retailers confuse the two or conflate the two. But if a merchant follows the transaction rules they've agreed to with their processor, fraud costs are borne by the financial institution.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Seeing none. Thank you so much, Steve, and all the proponents and opponents today. We'll go ahead and close the informational hearing on HB 2089. Committee, that concludes our work for today. Wednesday, we have 2 bill hearings on 2 fairly non-controversial Senate bills. And then we will also be hearing from our insurance commissioner, Vicki Schmidt. So we'll see you all Wednesday.